Okay, so what I thought I would do is record just a basic video. I'm not reading from a script or anything, um, about the thesis of the book and what I'm arguing essentially. And then I'll have a couple other videos where I will go through the actual table of contents, chapter by chapter, and give maybe a bit more detailed outline of what I'm doing. Of course, whatever I don't answer here, you can follow up with me and ask about. So the book is essentially about resolving some fundamental mysteries, puzzles that we have with our understanding of Jesus and his parables. Let's see if I can get the PowerPoint to advance. So pretty much everybody agrees that Jesus taught in parables and that this is his like most characteristic teaching genre. At the same time, we run into some problems with this. Let me move my video out of the way there. For all of the essentialness, you could say the essential nature of Jesus's parables, we run into some historical and literary problems. So here, for example, Joachim Jeremias writes, Jesus's parables are something entirely new. In all rabbinic literature, not a single parable has come down to us from the period before Jesus. Louisa Schottroff writes, the literary form parable belongs to the history of post-biblical parable culture that is not yet found in the First Testament. Bernard Brennan Scott writes, there is no contemporaneous evidence of parable tellers at the time of Jesus. The absence of parables attributable to the Pharisees should stand as an initial warning to those who would equate Jesus' parables with the later rabbinic parables. The parable genre does not appear in the Hebrew Bible nor in Hellenistic literature. Wow. Okay. So to summarize these quotes, they're basically saying, so far as historians can tell, Jesus of Nazareth is the first person in recorded history to use the genre called the parable with any regularity. We don't have it in the Hebrew Bible. We don't have it in contemporary literature, just Jesus. Okay, hang on a second. A few more quotations. Line Snodgrass. Rabbinic meshalim are numerous, some like Jesus' similitudes or other forms, but where are early narrative parables, such as those saying, a certain man, a sower went out to sow, a master wanted to settle accounts? The solid evidence for any Jew telling narrative parables before Jesus is hard to come by. The important thing is that little evidence exists that prior to Jesus, anyone was telling narrative parables. And then another point going the other direction. No early Christian writer after the New Testament tells parables. All right. Well, if you don't know these authors so far, these are basically heavyweights in the discussion about the parable genre. Jacob Neusner is also famous, one of the most prolific authors in history, a rabbinic specialist. And he writes, as to such similitudes as servant master, tower war, lost sheep, lost coin, the thief, faithful servant, children at play, leaven, seed growing of itself, on and on and on and on, treasure in the field, pearl of great price, fishnet, house builder, fig tree, returning householder, prodigal son, unjust steward, two sons, and the like. We have nothing of the same sort. Talking again about rabbinic literature in comparison to Jesus' parables. It is true that later rabbinic materials make use of similitudes, but the Pharisaic stratum, again, the time of Jesus, is notably lacking in them. Okay, so Jesus comes on the scene and he's telling parables everywhere, dozens of parables. And it's not as if they're just a few of them. They're in all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're in Thomas. They're in all the sources of these gospels. They're in Q, if you believe in Q. They're in the M tradition and the L tradition. So I might talk at the end about why I focus on the Gospel of Luke. But if you think about something, what the stereotypical examples of parables, Good Samaritan, Prodigal Son, Rich Man and Lazarus, all the famous examples are unique to Luke. Anyway, so we've not had a very satisfying explanation for the parable. The best that we can come up with so far is that Jesus invented a genre or somehow developed this genre inspired somehow from the past. The problem is this doesn't make sense according to any genre theory, and it's a most implausible scenario. A unique genre is a contradiction in terms, so that is rather unlikely. But if not, then you have to say, for example, that Jesus is drawing from a distinctive Jewish context that has left us no other record apart from what we see in the Gospels. And that's problematic because it's an unfalsifiable theory to say, oh, there must be an old tradition or there must be a ton of this happening, but there's no record of it. And also problematic because, as we just read from Jacob Neusner, we don't even have any secondary attestation of such a tradition. Even the rabbis aren't talking about the Pharisaic stratum using these. Okay, so how could it be that Jesus is the first figure in recorded history to make use of this supposedly new genre? So in my book, I basically say this doesn't work. And to me, there's a fairly obvious solution to this puzzle, which is the ancient fable. But before we get to that, what do we mean by parable anyway? And this is another, you could say, fundamental puzzle about the parable, not just how does Jesus the first one to use it, where the genre come from, also the terminology is kind of a mess. So the term parabole has a very broad usage in the Septuagint in the Hebrew Bible. So it comes out of the Hebrew term mashal, which is roughly coterminous with parabole, but not exactly. To just give examples of the way that parabole is used, both in the Septuagint and the New Testament, it doesn't map very well onto our English word parable, actually. So then Balaam uttered his oracle, parabole, saying, "Rise, Balak, and hear, listen to me, O son of Zippor." 1 Samuel 10, verse 12 is introduced with this parabole. Is Saul also among the prophets? Another example of a parabole, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness. To understand a proverb, parabole, and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. I will make them a horror, an evil thing to all the kingdoms of the earth, a disgrace, a byword, parabole, a taunt, and a curse in all the places where I shall drive them. Some more examples. From the fig tree, learn its parabole, its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Doubtless you will quote to me this parabole, Doctor, cure yourself. He also told them a parabole. Can a blind person, guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? This is a symbol, a parabole of the present time. So the Greek word from which we get the English term parable actually doesn't map very well onto what we mean when we say the word parable. And this is summarized often in the commentaries. In the Synoptics, parabole is used to identify proverbs, and this is just talking about the Synoptics, not even the Septuagint. Synoptics, parabole is used to identify proverbs, maxims, metaphorical sayings, thematic sayings, riddles, general rules, similes, in addition to quote-unquote parables. In other words, we have all different kinds of words in Greek for these different ideas of riddles and similes and so on. But in the Synoptic Gospels, proverb is not poemia, what we'd expect, it's parabole. Maxim is not nome, but parabole. Simile is not icon, it's parabole. Riddle is not enigma, it's parabole. In addition to the parable, which is also parabole. We have kind of a categorization problem going on here, obviously. And as Tyson and Mertz summarize, the Synoptics call all forms of Jesus' figurative discourse parabole, from proverbs or logia, which use imagery, to extended parables. And then the Septuagint also has a much wider tradition, again, using it for like taunts, oracles, all different sorts of things. And if you want to get into mashal, the Hebrew word, it's even broader. So some chapters in Job are called mashal. You have the whatever the parables of Enoch are, which are again more like oracles. So not at all what we mean when we say a parable. So how is it connected, this Greek term, with our English? Not very well. So one last example, the term parabole, commonly used in the Synoptic Gospels to denote the parables of Jesus, was brought over using the bridge of the Septuagint from the wide range in meanings of its Hebrew equivalent, mashal, which comprises a wealth of mostly short figures of speech. Okay, that part's fairly straightforward, but that's not the end of the problem. So what scholars do when they are talking about parables like the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Son, rich man and Lazarus, the widow and the judge, Pharisee and the tax collector, the lost sheep, these kinds of stories, they refer to them as parables proper, or true parables, or narrative parables. Richard Lisher summarizes here what is sometimes called a true parable is a freely invented short story with two or more characters whose action is cast into the past tense. Into this, we would probably add the story is told to draw a lesson from some sort of thing outside of the story. So let's see what we got here. Well, so the thesis of the book is that these parables proper, these narrative parables, are fables. Basically, what Lisher has just defined here is a pretty close definition of the ancient fable. And one way to, I guess, demonstrate this is to give you some examples. So if you remember from the quote from Neusner before, he's talking about the different kinds of similitudes that the rabbinic materials are lacking and that we don't have around the time of Jesus. So the thief, faithful servant, children at play, so on, lost sons, whatever. When you look at the first century fable material that we have, and we have a lot of it, hundreds of examples that biblical scholars haven't looked at, we find, lo and behold, examples of exactly these kinds of stories that parable scholars have been looking for but unable to find. Here's an example of treasure in the field from an ancient fable collection. A farmer who was about to die wanted his sons to be knowledgeable about the farm, so he summoned them and said, "My children, there is a treasure buried in one of my vineyards." After he died, his sons took plows and mattocks and dug up the entire farm. They did not find any treasure, but the vineyard paid them back with a greatly increased harvest. Then comes the moral. Thus they learned that man's greatest treasure consists in work. Okay, how about another one? How about a fishnet? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm blocking the wonderful picture here. A certain fisherman pulled in the dragnet that he had cast shortly before, and his fortune was that it was full of all kinds of delicious fish. But the little fish fled to the bottom and escaped through the openings, whereas the big ones were caught and laid out in the boat. This is a fable found in Babrius, a first or second century fable author. And it's also found in the Gospel of Matthew. It's also found in the Gospel of Thomas. The parallel is more than a little, I don't know, it's kind of obvious if you ask me. And what about another one? What about a prodigal son? A prodigal youth had consumed the inheritance from his father and had nothing left but his coat. Then one day he saw a swallow that had arrived ahead of the season, and being convinced that summer had already come and that he wouldn't need his coat any longer, he sold it too. But afterwards, winter returned with severe cold, and as the youth wandered around, he saw the swallow lying dead and neglected. He said to her, "Dear friend, you have destroyed both yourself and me." The fable shows that every untimely action is dangerous. So here we have a fable that survives in the Augustana collection, which is a prose collection. It survives in Babrius in a different version, and it's also found in Jesus' own version of it in the Gospel of Luke. So if I can finish moving my image around the screen. So how are fables defined? How are fables theorized? Where do they come from? So obviously that's what the book is about, so you have to open the book, but fables are already well theorized in antiquity, and right around the first century, we have an author called Theon who's describing the use of fable in rhetorical training. And this is how fables are defined in the first century context. Fable is a fictitious story picturing truth, after which we add the meaning of which it is a picture. Some important fable scholars basically follow this same definition. This is a perfect and complete definition, provided we understand the range of what is included under the term logos, story, and aletheon, truth. There have been many attempts to find a definition of the genre that takes cognizance of this diversity, but the most convincing one is still the description found in the rhetors Theon and Ophthalmius. Ophthalmius is another author of rhetorical treatises like this. Okay, and Van Dyck, this appears to be an ideal synthesis of ancient and modern fable theory. So, fables are brief, fictitious, metaphorical stories told in the past tense about fictional characters making a point external to them. This is exactly how parable scholars have defined the narrative parable. And it's not a coincidence that they come up with the very same definition. So why don't parable scholars then just understand that fables are the obvious context? No, the problem is biblical scholars, almost none of them know anything about the ancient fable. And this is not even necessarily the fault of biblical scholars either. As Leslie Kirk says, and Leslie Kirk is a classicist at, I believe, UC Berkeley, and she wrote an award-winning book on Aesop. And in this, she writes, in the case of the Aesop materials, much of which are fables, I confront the situation of an ancient tradition whose parameters and transmission are fiendishly complicated and difficult, and simultaneously largely unfamiliar to most professional classicists. In other words, it's not just biblical scholars who don't know about ancient fables and these materials, it's also classical scholars as well. Nicholas Holtzberg writes, in all of world literature, there is probably no author of high artistic standing who has been so stubbornly neglected, indeed basically ignored, by the relevant scholarship, in this case classicists, as Babrius, the fabulist, who is particularly fascinating for his narrative talent and whimsical wit. Babrius is, as I've mentioned before, is a fable author from the 1st or 2nd century who has many obvious connections to the stories that we find Jesus telling, the so-called narrative parables. Obviously, Babrius plays a large role in my book. And John Henderson writes about the 1st century author Phaedrus. So Phaedrus lived during exactly the same days as Jesus, from about 10 BC to about 50 or so, 50 or 40 AD. And John Henderson writes, let me let you into a very small secret. Hardly anyone at all is aware that the stories retold in this book exist. Talking about Phaedrus's fable collection. Well, so if classicists don't know about this materials, and biblical scholars definitely don't. This is why I think parable scholars have missed this genre altogether. I mean, there's other reasons as well, which I go into in the book. But based on that, I believe that narrative parables, the missing genre of literature that we're all looking for to compare with Jesus, is actually fairly obvious once you understand anything about 1st century fables. And so one obstacle is that classical scholars don't know this. Another is some basic myths, you could say, about what a fable is. And that's what I just skipped away from on the next slide. So when I've been talking about fables, you might have been thinking, well, isn't a fable just like a talking animal story? Well, from the examples that I gave before, indeed, there are talking animals in some fables, but there's also plenty of fables that are just about the daily lives of everyday people like these. And this is something that actually tends to frustrate fable specialists sometimes. This myth about the fable, confusion of animal story with Aesopic fable, and the resulting tendency to think of the latter in terms of the former, have prevailed in the minds of students of the fable ever since the time of Grimm, and are responsible for many misconceptions. Van Dyck writes, this may be explained by a combination of, on the one hand, the common misperceptions that all fables are about animals, plants, or inanimate objects, and have a moral purpose, and on the other hand, the equally universal aversion to everything which smacks of didacticism. The use of fables in education has a long history. However, any fable collection will show the untenability of a reduction of the fable characters to animals, plants, and objects, as we just saw. Teresa Morgan, who's joining into the Guild of Biblical Scholarship now, wrote in her popular morality book, a few scholars have tried to restrict fables to stories about animals, which has met with general skepticism. Too many non-animal stories, which otherwise look and behave like fables, survive, even within paradigmatic corpora like that of Aesop. And finally, Adrados, our idea of the fable as in what people think of today as fables comes in fact from the collections of La Fontaine and his continuers starting from the 17th century, who mainly collected fables with animals taking part. Our idea of the fable as an animalistic genre comes from certain collections of the modern era. In other words, my book is not about modern fables. My book is about the fables of the time of Jesus in the Gospels. So, the thesis of the book overall is that narrative parables are identical to fables. What we mean when we say true parable, narrative parable, that's the fable. Narrative parables emerged from and are best interpreted within the literary context of the ancient fable. What's more is Jesus is depicted as a fable teller in the Gospel of Luke, and perhaps the other Gospels, books on Luke, maybe others too. And finally, that conclusions about New Testament parables and beliefs about Jesus based on them obviously must be heavily revised when taking the fable into account. A lot of conclusions that New Testament scholars have drawn about parables are based on the idea that there's something unique to Jesus that no one else is telling them. So, for example, that this makes it a reliable tradition, because if no one else was telling parables, then obviously these are all authentic. Well, one big problem this book raises is, well, if they're not so unique, if in fact this is one of the most ubiquitous genres in the first century, then we have maybe some issues with that. And then I think I'll finish here with this slide. So why the Gospel of Luke? It's not that it's just the Gospel of Luke. In fact, so Matthew, I gave an example of a fable that has a parallel in the Gospel. And there's others in Thomas, for example, too. And I talk also about Mark in the book. But with Luke, it's top to bottom. And when you think about the most famous parables of the New Testament tradition, you'll think about some that are on this list: Good Samaritan, Friend at Midnight, Rich Fool, Big Tree, Lost Coin, Lost Son, Crafty Steward, Rich Man Lazarus, Worthless Slaves, Judge of the Widow, Pharisee Tax Collector. This whole list here, these are the examples that are unique to the Gospel of Luke. So Luke has a very particular tradition. He has all the most famous examples. He also has the trickiest examples, the hardest to interpret, like the crafty steward. And this is no coincidence. So Luke is, to me, the most highly educated gospel evangelist. Scholarship has shown that he's had the prognosmata training and various other signs that show he's basically a very literate author. And so he's basically crafting fables to show Jesus to be also a highly literate author and flexing his rhetorical muscle by telling us some very good examples, all of which we find in Luke. So that's kind of the big picture in a nutshell. I'll go through the outline and go chapter by chapter, but I think that should do it for right now. So I'll go ahead and stop this recording.